There's the everything is trying to kill you planet, which isn't really a biome so much as just like they're constantly running into hostile life.
Hmm.
There's a garbage planet where probably some corporation or whatever is just dumping all their garbage. My favorite things I discovered that I laughed at was uh, the Vancouver planet or the Southern California planet, because it's cheap to film there.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Author Neal Holtschlute joins me on a tour of the universe as we hunt for single-biome planets. These are staple locations in science fiction, most notably used in Star Wars, where a single ecosystem wraps an entire planet. How realistic are single-biome planets? And do we have some right here in our solar system? Neal, I want to tell you a joke first.
Oh, good.
Okay, here's my joke. This is a long joke, but it's fitting. Here we go. Ready? This is from Irregular Webcomics. Imperial officer tells Lord Vader, the rebels have fled the ice planet of Hoth. After going to the swamp planet of Dagobah, Skywalker has rejoined his friends on the desert world of Tatooine, and now the rebel fleet is massing for an attack on the forest moon of Endor. And Darth Vader says, I sense a great disturbance in the Force. And the Imperial officer goes, my lord? And Darth Vader says, how else can so many worlds be totally covered with only one terrain type without regard to latitudinal variations? I found that joke. I thought it was very fitting. What did you think?
It's good. It's very astute of Lord Vader.
So, Neal, you are returning to the podcast. I am so excited to have you back on. Thank you so much for being on here. Can you please, for those who did not listen to your other episode, introduce yourself and tell us about your latest projects?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to be here. So, my first novel, a science fiction novel called Crew of Exiles, released in October 2022, so not too long ago. And it's a sci-fi adventure about a transcendent being who is banished to a human body on Earth and has to cope with and perhaps rediscover his humanity along the way. And I'm very excited. During the time that I was getting that novel out, I was, of course, writing my next one. And I'm working up the courage and the research to start querying it out. And it's sort of a very personal family drama, but also science fiction, because that's what I like to do, about a man sort of struggling with getting his life put together and being the father he needs to be. So I'm very excited about that as well.
That's exciting. I'm always impressed by writers who finish one idea and move right into another idea. Like, I really admire that drive and motivation. So good for you. I'm excited about that project.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I find it hard not to want to jump right into that next idea. So
Yeah.
I don't know, that's how I feel about it.
I'm currently at a place where I have two ideas. I have a duology in my head. I have an idea kind of sitting in the wings. And this is the first time I felt this confident about ideas in a while. When I got my first big book, Agented, I couldn't get my brain out of it for some reason. And any other idea just was too related, and I couldn't remove myself from the characters in that other book. But now I think I have it figured out. So I always admire authors that are able to just move from project to project and, like, I'm assuming, detach themselves from the characters of the previous book and go into a whole new world with their new book, unless of course it's a sequel.
Right. Yes. I'm a standalone man for now.
seems less stressful. I think I'm actually impressed. I'm even trying a duology right now. I'm like, oh boy, I'm promising two things, but I hear you on the single book idea. Okay, I am doing a new thing this season where everyone gets rapid fire warm-ups. You ready for yours?
Yeah, yeah, I'm excited. Go ahead.
Okay. The first ones are easy, and I apologize if I've done this with you before. I try to have variety to it, but every now and then the same question kind of gets brought up. But are you a coffee or tea person?
More of a tea person, but I think mostly just my wife turned me on to that. I am not really a caffeine person, and coffee, I don't like the taste.
Gotcha. Which tea do you like?
Oh, what is it? It's like a cinnamon orange. That sort of
Mm.
vibe is what I like in my tea.
Hot or cold?
Hot.
Okay. I'm gonna have to look that up. Do you know what brand that you drink?
Oh shoot. No, not off the top of my head.
Okay, that's fine. I'll look for it. I've been trying to find a tea that isn't so caffeine heavy because I'm super sensitive to it.
Mm.
Okay, which is worse? Getting your wisdom teeth extracted or handing your first draft over to a stranger to read?
Wisdom teeth. No, no question. Um, I had a horrible experience getting my wisdom teeth out. And then, they take them out because like your molars like aren't coming in properly or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then the molars still didn't come in properly. And I had to have another surgery to take out two of my back molars.
Oh
So I'm missing some
no.
molars and had to get double the surgery. And it was miserable.
That sucks. That sucks. I feel like wisdom teeth, I've had my wisdom teeth out too, and I feel like they prescribed me Oxycontin or Oxycodone. I'm never sure how you pronounce it. And I feel like that was like it's like one of those gateway opportunities where you could accidentally get, hooked on that, the opium,
Yeah,
crisis and
yeah.
stuff like that. I hated it, by the way. Like it made me feel so awful. But,
Mm.
you have to be careful of what was it called? Dry rot or no, dry root?
No,
What?
I think that that sounds right. That dry rot, the dry socket, maybe
Dry
something like
socket.
that.
Yes. And it was the worst thing I'd ever gone through. And yeah, I agree. I would hand over my first draft before going into wisdom tooth
I'm
extraction.
excited to hand over the first draft. I'm there's some nerves, but I'm also excited usually. Yeah.
Okay. All right. These next questions are related to the topic. Of the following locations, where would you want your forever home? Would you want it to be in the mountains, the beach, the desert, or the forest?
Beach, although forest is a very, very close second. Um,
Ooh, okay.
I really, and I've never like lived that close to a beach, but I love the ocean and the beach. Yeah.
Okay. Do you like a lot of people in your forever home, like around you or
No, no,
okay.
I'm like on a beach on like a deserted island. Like,
Okay. That perfect for writing lots of stories, right? You get
yes,
that
yes.
time. Okay. And then of the Star Wars planets, where would you want to live and why?
So I was anticipating that you might ask a question about the Star Wars universe. So I had a little bit of pre-prepared thought on that, but that was not the question I was expecting. So which planet would I want to live on and why? Um, hmm, that's tough because, as we'll probably get into, the Star Wars planets are sort of the canonical things people point to when they talk about single biome. Well, it's just like the one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hoth is too cold. Absolutely not. Dagobah, I can't. I can't. It's just too wet and swampy. Um, I think Endor is probably the most pleasant one. I think, Tatooine is a bit harsh, even though I do live in the desert. I live in
Mm-hmm.
New Mexico currently, and I love it. But I think you got to go with Endor of the planets that I'm familiar with in the Star Wars. Not Coruscant, not the big city. No way. Got to go with Endor on that one.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for going through the very rough process of rapid fire warm up. Are you ready to move on to the topic itself?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the topic of single biome planets, I think was actually your idea when I was soliciting the listeners for, topics that they're interested in, and I added it to my list. And then I send the list out to all of our, participant or people who are prospective guests, and they choose from that list or they bring something new to the table. And I was amazed at the number of people that wanted to talk about single biome planets. And so when you said you wanted to do it, I was like, I feel like we have to talk because you were the one that put that topic on the list in the first place. And I was like, I'm curious to know what you have to say about it. So, clearly this seems to be very interesting to a lot of people. This was actually new to me because I didn't understand what that meant at first. And then I was like, oh, when I saw it in the Star Wars context, like, okay, I got it. But can you tell me what interested you in the topic, and what is it in the first place?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having the faith in me to encourage me to be the one to talk about it, because nothing made me more nervous than hearing that lots of other people wanted to talk about it, because I was immediately imposter syndrome
Oh no.
of oh well, if they want to talk about it, they must know more about it than I do. But I toyed around with the topic in my head, and talked about it a lot with my wife, and did a little bit of research myself to bone up on the topic. And I got more and more excited as the time of this recording approached. And so then your second question of what exactly does it mean? I I found that it's actually misused rather a lot. So if I'm being super technical, biome really has to do with life. It's got bio right there in the word. And a lot of times, I think people are simply using the word as maybe climate, or even just using the word as stereotype, right?
Mhm.
The desert planet. Okay, well, that's the stereotype of the planet, or the ice planet, right? That's the stereotype of the planet. So, biome itself, and I am going to quote you here because I did look this up. I think it's just from Wikipedia or whatever. A large naturally occurring community of flora and fauna occupying a major habitat, for example, forest or tundra. And then I would add, so like Mars, for example, doesn't count because there's no life on Mars, right?
Oh, I wanted to know
Um,
about Mars. Okay.
yeah, and I saw your questions prepared beforehand, and I'm happy to talk more about that. And I think that in some respects, because the way the word actually gets used, or the way the phrase single biome gets used, is as stereotype, stereotype planet, perhaps. I think in some respects we kind of need to speak to it as that meaning. But I would say that the technical meaning is the plants and animals that occupy this category of landscape. Like I said, forest, tundra, desert. And there are subcategories of that. I live in Albuquerque, high desert, as opposed to, like Death Valley, which is below sea level, low desert. And coastal, as opposed to uh uh well, I guess like maybe I was trying to subdivide coastal and then I couldn't think of another subdivision, but you get the idea. There's
Mhm.
different types of forests. There's rainforests, there's deciduous, and so on.
Would it be like coastal cliffs, like really high up cliffs versus coastlines that go into and like a beach?
Yeah, I'm no biologist, but that certainly seems like different subbiomes of coastal, like the high cliff versus what you said, sort of the sandy grassland into beach. Yeah.
Okay. So if we look at Earth, then we see that Earth is comprised of a ton of different ecobiomes. Am I saying that right? I'm
Oh,
not a
well, I
scientist.
didn't I didn't look up the technical definition of ecosystem or ecobiome, so I'm not 100% sure on that. But I would absolutely agree, and I think most people would agree with your statement of like, yeah, Earth has so many different biomes and ecosystems.
So for the sake of this podcast, when we're talking about single biome planets and fiction, is it
Mhm.
explored in like the stereotypical way of like we're just assuming it's all one type of thing all across this planet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the phrase means.
Okay. So then let's look at real life before
Mhm.
we jump into fiction. It would Venus be a single biome planet?
So when I did a little bit of my own research, uh, people certainly refer to Venus, Mars, and other planets as being exemplary of single biome. And what they really mean is sort of uniform. Venus is coated in a thick, toxic atmosphere, and it's coated in that all throughout. Mars
Mhm.
is a very thin atmosphere, cold. We would probably say desert, and it's like that all throughout. But even that is not strictly true. And the people, and I know I'm probably getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but the people that criticize this idea of single biome point out that neither of these planets or any planet is uniform in terms of the amount of light it receives, in terms of the height of the landscape, the geography of it. If it has any atmosphere at all, it has weather conditions, whether those be the toxic weather conditions of Venus or, sort of the sandstorms and such of Mars. So those are all variations that have to exist. And I think that that's important to recognize, up to a point, at least in terms of, asking about the real life planets. But at the same time, we sort of can also categorize, loosely, Mars is a desert planet. Loosely, Venus is this, hot, thick atmosphere type planet. So I don't want to be wishy-washy. I'm going to wear my colors on my sleeve and tell you right away that I think the idea and usage of single biome planets is both valuable and a good thing in fiction. But to be perfectly technical, they don't exist. They don't exist as far as we know, because planets are going to have variation in temperature and geography. I mean, even those two alone. And then if you add in atmosphere, then they have variation of weather as well.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be more just an easier way for us to classify and market so that we can very quickly say, like some of the planets that we're discovering right now, there's a planet made entirely of diamonds or something, the diamond planet. There's a planet that's raining. I forgot what it was, but like that's how they define it to the general public. So we think, oh yeah, that one planet has that one specific attribute, and therefore it must be the entire surface is that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that you said a key phrase there. That's how it's presented to the public. So part of it is, we're probably consuming pop culture media, or if not even pop culture, like, we're probably not reading the astroscientists published papers
Yeah.
on what they're talking about. And I think that, like, to put it in a succinct manner, the moon is a fairly uniform planet, or not planet, but a moon in my mind and in most people's minds. And in my experience, if I could even walk around on the moon, it would be a fairly uniform experience for me. Mm-hmm. However, you take a geologist up there and let them dig around, and I think they're going to tell you, oh no, it's so diverse. There's so many layers to it, and it really, you can read all these layers and learn about the history of it, and it's so dynamic and interesting, right? Yeah. So I think that I want to talk about perspective a lot today, I guess. And I think that perspective is super important when talking about single biome planets.
Interesting. Okay. So let's go into the fictional examples. And the one I wanted to bring up and get your perspective on is the water planet in Interstellar, where they land, to summarize it for the listeners, they land on, they're trying to find their buddy who's stranded on some planet, and they've got several planets to choose from, and they go to this particular planet, and when they land, it's entirely covered by water, and there are these like huge waves that travel the entire I don't know what you call it, surface area of the planet, and they, that's the ticking time bomb of when the next wave is going to come through. And so they decide that that's not the right planet. It's kind of chaotic, and they finally leave. When they get back, years have passed. Like every second on there was like, I don't remember, just a significant time period passed between being on the surface and going back up. What would that be? Is that a single biome planet where you just have one water just washing around the planet? And could that happen?
Could it happen? I think there's widespread agreement that it could.
Okay.
Earth itself, I mean, you don't even have to add that much water, relatively speaking, to flood all of the Earth, to make it so that there is no ground sticking out above the water level. So I think that there's general agreement in the scientific community that an or at least a water-coated planet is very reasonable. I think that in the general sense, yes, we would say it's a single biome planet. again, to be a little bit wishy-washy, there would certainly be different biomes to someone who was a biologist, for example. There would be the shallow ocean, where creatures who needed more warmth or needed that sunlight or needed to breathe the air would be found. There would be the deeper ocean biome, and perhaps there would be hydrothermal vent biome. To speak of just a few, if assuming there's not even bird life, life above the surface of the water. So, it's that idea of perspective of if you're an outsider or a person who's not educated in such a way to perceive all those different biomes, then yeah, water planet, one biome. It's a water planet. That's literally what we just said, right?
Yeah.
But if you got into the details of it, even if Earth was fully covered in water, there's no way people would say it's a single biome.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, so then trying to pick apart what little information we know about this, and maybe there's way more information about this than I'm aware of, and all the experts can certainly tell us on social media. But the idea that you have this constant wave moving around the planet, and when they land, they're able to just shuffle around. It's not deep. So that makes me wonder if the wave has worn down the crust or like the surface so that like at no point did they fall in off a underwater cliff. And if the wave is so consistent, does that mean that it's very smooth? Like, would different sorts of geological makeup or surface differences change the way the water is moving around the planet? Would it create a lot more torrential storms? I don't know where I'm going with that, but that's where I'm thinking as far as what can we get out of what we think this planet's made out of.
Right. Well, you're certainly not asking an expert in this particular area. So we're both going to be hypothesizing a lot, but that's what we're here for, maybe.
We're writers. That's what writers do.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I don't know how much that water would wear down the surface or what sort of time scale. I mean, if you've got any sort of active tectonics, there's occasionally going to be volcanic activity. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how, I mean, on a geological time scale, maybe, the movement of that water would wear it down relatively quickly. But, even right there, uniformity is like time is an aspect of uniformity. How long does it take that wave to circumnavigate the planet? There's going to be differences of whether you're on, the peak or the trough of the wave itself. So, the single biome idea, like, yeah, it's still a water planet, but that's sort of one of the things that always makes these planets interesting is that it's never just like, the entire planet is made up of gray paste that's completely uniform.
Yeah.
Or if it was, even that would be interesting, I guess, in and of itself, in its lack of any differentiation.
Gotcha. Okay, so then what are some of your examples?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked because as I started really thinking about it, I came up with or found, more and more different single biome planets. So there's the everything is trying to kill you planet, which, isn't really a biome so much as just like, they're constantly running into hostile life.
Mm-hmm.
There's a garbage planet where, probably some corporation or whatever is just dumping all their garbage. The example that comes to mind, I don't know how well known this movie is, but there's an old Kurt Russell movie called Soldier. It's a sci-fi movie on a garbage planet. One of my favorite things I discovered that I laughed at was the Vancouver planet or the Southern California planet, because it's cheap to film there.
That's funny. Where it's everything is like mildly like nice weather. Is that why?
So having never really been to either of those places, my understanding is that the Vancouver planet is sort of a moderately temperate forested planet, and then the Southern California, I think it's desert, isn't it? I'm not 100% sure.
Desert with like beach and coastal, some vineyards. I used to live in Southern California for a very short part of time.
So also a fairly pleasant climate.
Very pleasant, yeah.
But mostly desert, yeah. And then there's some of the truly bizarre planets. So there was a 90s Nickelodeon cartoon, Invader Zim, And Invader Zim introduces the parking structure planet, which the entire planet is covered in parking structures. And then also perhaps my favorite, the fast food planet of Foodcortia, which is entirely covered in fast food establishments.
Oh my, so at this point, we're just using planets as destination. Like the whole universe is ours to travel. Um, just milestones, planet to planet to planet.
Yeah, and like that's literally what Star Wars does.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm currently in the middle of the first season of Andor, and I'm loving it. You know, people recommended it to me, and I finally watched it, and like it's fantastic. But I have to, and it's very serious. But I have to giggle a little bit every time. You know, my brain just shifts, and I miss the gear I'm trying to shift into when somebody shows up on some planet, and the scene before they were on some other planet, like planets have always been and continue to be in the Star Wars universe treated as certainly different towns, you
Mm-hmm.
know, if not even closer together, as a, like maybe even just like the lake on one side of town and, you know, the forest on the other side of town. Uh, the Star Wars universe, I joke, you know, fits in 30 square acres.
Interesting. Well, that raises a good point because each destination they go to has a very unique or specific kind of setting that, of course, mirrors what we would see here on Earth. But I would think for a planet to have, well, that just makes me think that instead of westward expansion on one continent, we did westward expansion across all the planets. Because I would think
Mm-hmm.
if a society were to evolve on a planet, you would have a lot of diversity or hierarchies or social structures that are very, unique or specific to that planet, rather than just like, oh, these people settled here kind of feeling, because it looks and feels very familiar to maybe other planets.
Right. I think that, you know, that familiarity versus, you know, what they want is distinctiveness. They want it to be
Mm-hmm.
distinctive so you can remember. I mean, going back to Andor in particular, holy cow, the show is sprawling. It takes place with many different characters in many different locations. But yeah, at least I find myself not losing track because everyone's dress and mannerism and location, of course, so distinctive. You can tell at a glance every scene where it takes place, who you're about to see, you know, involved in this scene.
Okay. So would you say that distinction is about the same as how you would distinctly characterize different cultures and landmarks on Earth?
Yeah, I would. I mean, you know, we always want to be careful, particularly in the real world,
Mm-hmm.
to not be harmful with our stereotyping. And what I mean by that, I mean, stereotyping has a very negative connotation, but it's just reality that when we come across new information about a person, place, or thing, we immediately need some way of categorizing it based on what we're familiar with. So we're going to stereotype it. Now, the important thing is simply to recognize that we're doing that and not just continue to forever judge it based on the first impression, but to,
Mm-hmm.
you know, develop one's understanding as you learn more about a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Like not immediately categorize something with otherness as which would perpetuate, I think, the idea that just because they're different means they're wrong, or that they're, something to fear, before you've at least had a chance to like get to understand that other society, or that other, I don't even know what you would call. I haven't seen Andor. I've seen Mandalorian, but I guess that other civilization on that other planet.
Yeah, I 100% agree. As long as you're not immediately bringing negative judgment along with the stereotype, and as long as it's not being perpetuated, you know, it's just reality that we classify things when we're
Mm-hmm.
first encountering them.
It's such an important point because my manuscript with my agent right now, it has a lot of alien stuff. Like I had a lot of fun with that. And I originally wrote my character to be kind of like startled because this is stuff she's never seen before. But my agent made a point. She wrote notes all throughout the manuscript, and um, she's like, this could be misinterpreted as like otherness. So what if she were to look at these creatures or characters, or, other different species with awe, with curiosity?
Hmm.
And that didn't affect, like, her change suggestion doesn't affect the book at all. If anything, it like strengthened it. But I thought that was like a really interesting switch on like what you might think might, like, for example, if I walked into a onto a planet that was only occupied by human-sized spiders, I would be pretty terrified because I'm terrified of tiny sized spiders. But the idea of like breaking that internal, like immediate, like gut punch reaction and changing it to a positive of like, instead of being terrified, actually, maybe you're intrigued. And especially given like the lightheartedness tone of the book, I thought that was a really good choice. But it got me thinking like of like how we internal, like our internal biases are and how we can like examine those things.
Absolutely. You and I are speculative fiction writers, and perspective is such an important aspect of speculative fiction, and expanding people's perspective and challenging people's perspective. And I have to make a note of the thing I thought of when you used that specific example of the spiders is a book by Werner Vinge, I believe I'm pronouncing that name correctly, Vinge, called A Deepness in the Sky. And the alien race is giant spider-like creatures. And I don't want to spoil it, but he throws in this perspective shift almost as an afterthought in terms of the plot of the story. But it's really a profound look at how our perceptions are shaped, both by our experience and our expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting balance. It's like a push-pull, because then we're also dealing with horror writing where they lean into the fear of the unknown or the fear of the different, and in some cases the fear of the familiar. But we humans are constantly being inundated with like contrasting perspectives on the same thing, where that giant spiders from a different planet, that's terrifying because it's now, there's plenty of horror movies that are based off of spiders, right? Versus, no, the spider is actually kind. We shouldn't be making these snap judgments because you associate it with something else. And we get that. We get all these different signals. And, balancing all those things, it requires like, I guess, a lot of vigilance on our part to be responsible, and while also understanding some of like why we feel the way that we feel because of what we're exposed to.
Yeah, I agree. That was well said.
All right. Any other examples?
No, I mean, so we have what have we gone through so far? So we've gone through desert planet,
Mm-hmm.
ice planet, water
Yep.
planet. Um,
City
I think
planet. Should we talk
so.
about
City
Coruscant?
planets, yeah, city planets, Coruscant.
You said you wouldn't want to
Um,
live there, right?
no, 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 no. I don't want to live there. That seems miserable. All that bustle and noise and inescapable noise, I think
Uh-huh.
is the worst part of that. And then of course, sort of your fringe, goofier ones, garbage planet, food court planet. You can almost literally just come up with a word, and then you have that planet. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a planet where the dominant life form is free roam sofas, and the sofas are of course uh, hunted and killed and stuffed, and then sold to people to sit on in their living rooms. So there's
Whoa.
a ridiculous number of different silly planets we could come up with. But I think that about covers it. Oh, one more realistic planet that I do want to mention, just to make sure I don't forget it, because I think it's so interesting, is a tidally locked planet. Now, a tidally
Mm.
locked planet could have different surface, could be water, could be um, terrestrial, or whatever. But to explain what this means, so one good example is that our moon is tidally locked to the Earth, which means the same side of the moon always faces the Earth. But a more interesting tidally locked planet might always keep the same side facing its sun. And what's cool about that is, for one thing, you'd never have a sunrise or a sunset.
Ooh, yeah.
And then furthermore, since one side is always facing the sun and one side is always facing away, all of the heat is concentrated on the one side, and the other side would be very, very cold. And a really interesting idea I came across was, I didn't invent this, was the idea that such a planet, if it had life, might have plants where the leaves of different plants, not of the same plant, sort of have a rainbow spectrum where they go from and I don't know which, if they would be sort of on the red end of the spectrum or the blue end of the spectrum, but one end would be on the sort of hotter side, closer to the sun, absorbing those wavelengths of light. And as you moved around the edge of the planet, the edge that was, facing the star, you would have the plants be adapted to absorb the different spectrums of light that were striking the surface at those points. They'd have different colored leaves, and you'd get maybe like a spectrum or like a rainbow effect to your foliage. And that was just a beautiful image that stuck in my brain. And so I had to mention it.
That's interesting. So the Terminator, the point where the day meets the night.
Yes.
That would be really interesting. So in 2312, I'm going to quote Kim Stanley Robinson again, Mercury is not exactly tidally locked. A lot of people make that assumption, but it's like, it's just not. I don't remember what the exact numbers are. And so his example of civilization doesn't follow that strict, sun dark, like permanent sun and permanent dark. But for a planet that is, I'd imagine that, and you're talking about plant life, so that means that it's not too close to the sun, it's far away enough for it to sustain life, that I'm imagining society kind of lives on that terminator, that point between day and night, because would it be too hot to go onto the sun only surface, and of course too cold to go on the night only, like nothing would have grown? Or maybe there's like, what do they call them, extremist organisms that grow that grow in like the worst conditions, like maybe you'll see more of that on the sun side or the dark side.
Yeah. So it certainly depends on how much, solar radiation the planet is receiving, how far away would it need to be for like human life versus other forms of life. But we can certainly imagine a planet that was at the right distance where humanity, human life would thrive on that terminator line, that boundary between light and dark. And we sort of think of that as a natural habitat for life because life thrives on boundaries. There needs to be, I'm going to use the words chaos and order, and I think there's some appropriateness to that, but you can sort of interpret chaos as heat and light and energy, and order as safety and shelter, right? It can't be too cold, but it can't be too hot. We need this sort of intermediate place. And the terminator line of a tidally locked planet facing its star is a perfect example of that sort of boundary layer. And then you mentioned extremophiles. And I think a lot of folks who are focusing on the more realistic end of single biome planets argue that they probably do exist in real life. And we can imagine like Europa, there's a possibility that the Jupiter moon, Europa, has life under its surface. Now, if that life exists, probably the most obvious place that we would look would be a geothermal vent under the ocean water, under the surface of Europa, because it needs that. We know life as we know it needs that heat, that energy that would come from the volcanic activity under the surface. And it's a little bit hard to imagine that there would be any other biome than those geothermal vents on Europa. So that would, by definition, that would be a single biome planet. It has that one biome. And another reason that I should have mentioned earlier why this topic probably resonates with a lot of people and resonated with me is we're at such an interesting time with like the James Webb Space Telescope, for example, in learning about planets that might support life beyond the Earth, beyond the solar system, of course, as well. And this question of, okay, well, are single biome planets realistic or are they not, is partly a question of what is life like in the rest of the universe. And I think that's an inherently interesting question. And I think probably a lot of, the other people who were prospective podcast guests also thought that. And going along with that question, just to extend it even a little bit further, is okay, suppose there is life under the surface of Europa at the hydrothermal vents. A follow-up question is it then a single biome planet? Or, given enough time, would that life spread out into the ocean under the surface? Or, stated another way, how adaptable is life? Because we don't really know the answer to that question, I think. I mean, maybe a biologist can get on and tell me I'm wrong here, and I'd love to have that happen and learn more. But it's on Earth, basically every part of the Earth has some sort of life that lives there. So life has adapted and spread across the entirety of the Earth. Now, does that mean that Earth is just uniquely suitable for life? Or does that mean that life is suitably adaptable, that it's gonna spread wherever it gets a foothold? And
Interesting.
that's kind of the answer to the single biome question in reality. Is, well, if we knew about other planets, are they diverse? Is the life there spreading to other biomes? Or is there a limit to how much life can adapt? Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, life finds a way, right? Does it find a way, or are there limitations to that? I think it's a fascinating question.
That makes me think of the theory that life came to Earth from a meteor that crashed into Earth, and that was like the start of it. The idea that, there's adaptation from even that early point of time there. I mean, it is kind of remarkable because when you look at Earth and the events of the solar system and how there was a lot of volatility, as you were saying, you need that volatility. And how a large portion of our Earth comes from different places, and it all kind of works together to where we end up being today. It is an interesting concept to think, are we, is the idea that, are we special, or
Yep.
or are we not special? I guess
Yep.
ultimately is what it comes down to.
Yep. That's a great question, and definitely related to this question of single biome planets.
Well, my next question is, when do you think we're going to get our own trash planet? Because I think that's probably the most realistic one in the near future.
Yeah. No, that's dark, but you're not wrong about that. We're quickly converting our mostly water categorized planet to a mostly trash categorized planet. That's pretty horrifying.
Yes, why we should just be throwing them into the sun at this point.
Yeah, right. Well, if flying a spaceship out of a gravity well was as easy as it was in Star Wars, we would certainly be throwing our trash into the sun already.
uh, priorities. We'll
Yeah,
figure it out one day. Okay.
yeah, right.
So what advice do you have for writers like me? I didn't know anything about single biome planets until we decided to prep for this episode. What advice would you give that want to tackle this topic? Is it something that I should freely continue to use, like Star Wars, where it's just, little towns along the great, roadway of the universe? Or like,
Yeah.
what do you think?
So I am in favor of single biome planets. Assuming we've defined that term. Assuming everybody agrees with my definition of that term. um, I watched a video unrelated to preparation for this recently or the series, I believe, is called Trope Talk on YouTube. It's by Overly Sarcastic Productions. And a quote from that stuck out with me. Having a stereotype is very different from being a stereotype. And I think it is great for authors to write a new place, or even a new, they're mostly talking about cultures, but write a setting as a stereotype initially from the perspective of potentially an outsider or the reader who's only just encountering this thing, but don't make it an actual stereotype. So, Dune, Arrakis, a classic desert world, right, is stereotyped as a desert world. But when you learn more and more about it, it's so richly peopled, and even the ecology of it. I mean, I believe Frank Herbert was trained as an ecologist, and he put a lot of that into the novel. When you do learn more about, I used the example of the moon earlier. when you learn more about the geology and history of the moon, you can no longer see it as, oh, well, it's just a gray rock with craters.
Mm-hmm.
And you perceive that interesting depth to it. But I recommend it. I think single biome planets are excellent. And I also want to say that George Lucas, for all his flaws as a writer or storyteller, did an amazing job with his single biome planets. And look at just actually, no, I'm going to talk about his whole universe. So Hoth is this freezing, hostile planet. And we don't see that in A New Hope. And like even the title right there, you don't see this freezing, hostile planet in the movie with Hope in the title.
Mm-hmm.
You see it in the movie with Empire Strikes Back in the title. The movie that is, dark and hostile to the characters, the one in which the villains are winning. The single biome of every imperial structure ever. You see the halls of Star Destroyers and the Death Star, and it's all these like polished surfaces. It looks like you could eat off of the floor in those places. And the only life that we really see, I mean, human life, I'm not counting, the only non-human life we really see aboard an imperial ship, at least in the original trilogy, is the like tentacle monster thing in the trash compactor. And there's such a powerful symbolism there of this is the future that an imperial victory represents, is that if you want to be something different that doesn't live within the confines that the Imperials define, you can live amongst our trash. You can live on the fringe and be thrown away. And,
sad.
I don't know how much
sad.
George Lucas like intended all of that directly, but I absolutely believe that his subconscious mind was doing that from a place that was educated on symbolism. I mean, the dude knows his symbolism.
Mm-hmm. Now I feel bad for the tentacled monster. I'm like, oh, we see that as a scary thing, but it's just trying to do its thing. It's trying to exist.
It totally is. There's a book set in the Star Wars universe. I believe it's called From a Different Point of View. It's a series of short stories, all written by different authors, and there's one from the perspective of the trash compactor monster, and it's lovely.
Oh, I'll have to check it out. Well, Neal, thank you for giving me that new perspective. I love hearing that. That's amazing. And thank you again for joining the podcast. Is there any final remarks that you'd like to make?
No, I want to thank you again for inviting me along. I'm so glad that this discussion turned out, and I hope to hear from other folks who watch this, who listen to this, on your social medias or wherever, and see, people who were excited about this topic. What are some ideas that we didn't necessarily talk about? And maybe you should have, and maybe, I don't know, it can be a future conversation, or we can hold that conversation on there. One other last thing. Oh, before I forget, my science fiction novel, Crew of Exiles, I want to mention that I'm going to do a sale of the ebook on Amazon to coincide with the release of this podcast. It'll be down to 99 cents. So I strongly encourage you to go out and pick it up. There's no particular single biome planets, but I do try to use those settings in symbolic ways and ways that sort of get into your brain. There's some virtual reality settings that are, like I have the virtual reality of the pseudo medieval fantasy world, and the paradise world, and sort of the war-torn world, among others. And so going back to sort of what I would recommend for authors, use settings to enhance your story. Use that symbolism. Use exactly as much depth and nuance to the setting as your story calls for, and as the perspective of the character calls for.
Do you think that we could have a virtual reality planet?
Absolutely. I feel like there's a lot of like cyberpunk that's kind of in that vein, or heading towards it.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.